Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminolly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, horror. This is the first instalment in a new series where I'm going to be looking at British horror novels from the 70s, 80s and beyond, starting with this one from 1973, The Irish Witch by Dennis Wheatley. So this is a video reboot of a series of reviews I did a few years ago for a website I was involved in writing for, where I looked at a range of different British horror novels. And the way I've structured it was I started with 1973, which was the year I was born, and then took it through to the end of the 1990s, looking at one or two books from each year as we go through. The reason I started with 1973 is very deliberate. So firstly, it's, as I said, the year I was born. Secondly, it's the year before The Rats by James Herbert came out. So I consider The Rats to be an absolute landmark book in the horror genre, and in particular in British horror. So starting the series the year before that with an example of the kind of horror that was around before James Herbert started writing, I thought was quite an interesting an interesting starting point. And as I said, the book I'm going to talk about today is The Irish Witch by Dennis Wheatley. So Dennis Wheatley was a very popular, very well known, very long standing British kind of horror and thriller writer, and very much part of like the old guard, if you like, that existed before the likes of James Herbert came onto the scene. Why is it called Carry On Screaming? So if you don't know, and you may well not, the Carry On films is a long-running series of British comedy films, started in, I think, kind of the 50s, but were particularly popular in the 60s and 70s. So they are kind of slightly bawdy, definitely politically incorrect, very silly comedy films where they would take a different kind of theme for each film and just run with it. So different characters in each film, typically the same actors, or there was certainly a central cast of actors who appeared in the majority of the films, but each film would have a different subject. So Carry On Screaming was their take on the horror genre, and I will put in the description for the video a couple of links to clips on YouTube from Carry On Screaming, so you can see what it's like, but I'll put some stills up as well. So very silly films. They have not dated well in terms of their humour, their depiction of minorities and things like that, but they were very much a mainstay of kind of British cultural life in the 70s when I was growing up, to the extent that there were TV series that just showed clips from the Carry On films. So they would just pick out clips from the Carry On films and show them on TV rather than showing the whole films. The humour, I guess, if you're familiar with British TV shows like Are You Being Served, which I understand was popular in the States at one time, it's very much that kind of humour. So yes, it felt like an appropriate title for a series of videos and reviews of British horror novels starting in the 70s. So anyway, let's talk a bit about Dennis Wheatley. So as I've said, Dennis Wheatley was hugely popular, hugely successful, wrote dozens and dozens of books. Started writing in the 1930s, so his first book came out in the 30s, and he died in 1977. So The Irish Witch, coming out in 1973, was one of his last books, and he wrote he wrote kind of thrillers and kind of war novels and things like that, but was particularly well known for writing thrillers with a kind of satanic bent, and The Irish Witch definitely has that. So this is part of a long-running series. He wrote about a character called Roger Brook, who was kind of a hero. It's set in, I think, the kind of 1800s. Set in the 1800s. And Roger Brook is the central character, but the kind of horror element of the book comes more from Roger's daughter, Susan, who's a young woman who's featured in this book. So in the book, Susan is has fallen for this slightly shady young man, and he is trying to persuade her to become part of what is called the New Hellfire Club. So the Hellfire Clubs were real things in kind of the 17 and 1800s, in that they were clubs for kind of the wealthy, for wealthy young people and older people that allowed people to kind of get in touch with their baser side. So lots of kind of drinking and debauchery, but kind of, you know, a tinge of occultism in there as well. So kind of a bit of a free-for-all, you know, club for, you know, people who wanted to explore different kinds of sex and things like that. So this young man is trying to persuade Susan to come to this Hellfire Club with him, which is run by this woman who is the Irish witch, who on the blurb for the book on the back is described as a sensuous wanton. And I should also show a picture of what Dennis Wheatley looks like on the back of this book. I said he was part of the old guard. And, you know, that definitely looks like someone who is part of the old guard, doesn't it? Hopefully that's come out okay. If it hasn't, I'll put up a full screen picture of him. But yeah, that is definitely the face of a man who has lived and drunk a lot of port, which I assume is what's supposed to be in that glass next to him. So yes, that's basically the plot, and the book starts with that, with this young man trying to persuade her to come to the Hellfire Club, and some kind of scenes of the Hellfire Club which are suitably kind of horrific and, you know, sexually explicit. And then the book takes a complete detour, and the next few hundred pages, so it's like over 400 pages long, so probably 300 of those pages are Roger Brook going adventuring around Europe and America, and kind of going on secret missions and things like that. And it's just completely a historical thriller for, you know, 300 pages or so, before at the end it coming back to the Hellfire Club with a, you know, a climax that is suitably graphic and debauched and horrific, and, you know, features Satanism and all that good stuff, which, you know, the cover promises all of those things. They actually take up probably less than a quarter of the book. And I would say the historical adventure part of the book is a lot of fun. It's quite entertaining if you like that kind of thing, but it's definitely not horror, albeit there is kind of a supernatural element that runs throughout it, in that there's kind of a crystal ball, and Roger Brook can see what's going on back in England through this crystal ball. So yeah, it's very silly. It's very exploitative in terms of exploiting people's fascination with that kind of thing. This fascination that there was in the 70s with you know, kind of Satanism as being a kind of route into sexual debauchery and you know, and excess. And looking back to, you know, kind of Walpurgis and the kind of discussions we had then, this is definitely trash, in that it's definitely exploiting that public desire to know more about that kind of thing, but then putting it safely in a historical context so that it doesn't feel, you know, threatening to a modern audience. And when I come on to talk about James Herbert, that's something I think, you know, James Herbert just smashes through, is that tendency for horror fiction in the UK in particular before then to be set in the past, so it was safe and it could explore these kind of darker themes but in a safe way that was completely non-threatening. So James Herbert, just, you know, his books are starkly contemporary in comparison to this, which, you know, is largely a historical adventure novel with a bit of horror thrown in for good measure. So yeah, as I kind of trailed, the book I will be talking about next month is The Rat by James Herbert. So I'm intending that these videos I will do one a month. They will be on a Wednesday. So the routine on a Wednesday now will be every other Wednesday you will get an Ask Criminale, and then on those other Wednesdays when I'm not doing Ask Criminale, you will either get a Carry On Screaming, where I'll talk about some British horror, or you will get my classics read through. So I did Moby Dick a couple of weeks ago, and I will be doing the Iliad in 2 weeks' time. So my October classics video will be on the Iliad by Homer, and then later in October I will do The Rats by James Herbert. So I hope you've enjoyed that. Let me know if you like the idea of Carry On Screaming and the kind of books I'm going to be covering in it. Let me know also if you've read any Dennis Wheatley over the years and what you think of him. I know some people have mentioned Dennis Wheatley in the comments before, so I know he does have some fans out there. And I have to say, I read a couple of his other books years and years ago. This is the only one I've read recently. And whilst, you know, it doesn't really deliver on the promise of the cover, it was a lot of fun and I did enjoy it. Okay, time for another random book from the shelf. So I thought I would pick something historical, as The Irish Witch is a historical adventure. So I've gone with Flashman at the Charge by George MacDonald Fraser. So this is also partly in honour of one of my commenters, Harry Flashman, who leaves lots of not always very encouraging but interesting comments on my videos. So this one's for you, Flash. So yes, if you've not read the Flashman books by George MacDonald Fraser, they are hugely entertaining series of kind of comic historical adventures about a character called Harry Flashman, who is a bit of a bounder and a scoundrel and a coward, but somehow manages to get involved in various famous battles and things like that. So this one has him at the charge of the Light Brigade, I think. I've not read this one yet. I've read a few of them. They're all very entertaining, very silly, but very, very funny. So as always, thanks very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.